People Before Profit fully supports this bill, the proposed microgeneration bill. I want to also commend Deputy Stanley for bringing it forward. But it seems to me that you would be fully supporting this bill, Minister, and any government would, if they understood and really got it, what climate change actually means. We believe that the dangers of catastrophic climate change are a priority issue facing us, and I know you would say that, but what you do doesn't actually prove it, because it means we have to urgently look at how we consume and produce energy and take all the steps needed to switch massively to renewables while reducing our consumption. And democratising the energy grid is a vital step in this process, which would allow us to actively engage households and communities in making the switch to renewables on the scale and in the timeframe that's needed. The recent reports, particularly the one from the IPCC, I think has utterly changed the narrative on this issue, when they said limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees would require rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. And your attitude to this bill, Minister, is none of the above. Those changes will mean leaving 80% of proven reserves of fossil fuels in the ground. It will mean cutting our emissions by 10% annually until we get down to negative emissions. And Minister, I'd like to ask you a direct question if you accept that this is necessary, because the changes that the IPC talk about are there to avoid extremely dangerous as opposed to dangerous climate change. That is the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees of a global temperature increase. So I think we should be clear about it, that both of those overheating measurements mean a death sentence that will hang over large parts of humanity and large parts of the world's biodiversity. The difference, however, is, do we want to condemn large parts of humanity and Earth's life to a climate and a planet which is not conducive to habitable life? A lack of action means that we are effectively saying we can't reduce CO2 emissions, so we accept that the future is one of extreme and deadly heat waves, longer drought periods, failing crop harvests and rising sea levels. You would think, Minister, wouldn't you, that given this, and given that what scientists say to us, all of our resources, all of our ingenuity and all our creativity would be marshalled into doing what's required, that is, reducing and eliminating our use of fossil fuels. You would think any government which understood that and understood what's at stake would be moving heaven and earth to get us off oil, coal and gas in all areas and utilising all available renewable energy. But in fact, your government has displayed breathtaking ignorance and disregard for these realities. Your government is opposing my own bill, as was previously mentioned, to ban oil exploration of fossil fuels so that we can't use it, and I understand you're now stalling on Deputy Stanley's bill. Just like you stalled on Joan Collins's bill on the water referendum, you've kicked a touch on anything progressive that's coming from the opposition. Sinn Féin's bill on bandit hours, protecting defined benefit pensions, our bill on sex education or medicinal cannabis. In opposing my own bill to ban exploration for fossil fuels that we can't use, I think that this shows breathtaking ignorance. You continue to pursue an agricultural policy that's unsustainable and will massively grow our national emissions, and continue to pursue policies in public transport and housing and development that ignore the reality of the scientific facts of climate change. But what we get, Minister, is spin, and the speech that that Minister just gave is absolute spin, and you are very, very good at it. One of the key challenges we face is mobilising popular support for the measures that must be taken to avoid catastrophic climate change. And some people feel to spread opposition farms around the country. They call it NIMBYism, but I understand that opposition, and I argue that it is not just NIMBYism. There are legitimate reasons. If you want to win people to forms of renewable energy, then we have to seek the involvement of the communities and the local people in any project. Telling them that they must accept massive wind farms put up by faceless multinationals interested only in profit is really not good enough. And telling them also that they have to have a carbon tax is really not good enough. We will lose the battle against fossil fuel corporations and vested interests if all we have to offer is a vision of the future with carbon taxes for ordinary people and large windmill farms making profits for major international private companies. It's worth remembering that carbon tax comes from the same ideological source as carbon trade-offs, offsets and clean development mechanisms, market mechanism ministers that have all failed in reducing carbon emissions. Relying on similar ideas from the same neoliberal school will also fail. We need much more radical action. One step is to seek to democratise the energy grid, as is proposed in this bill. The aim of this bill is similar to one of the measures that I proposed in 2016 when I put an amendment to the energy bill which sought to give access to the national grid for small-scale producers of renewable energy, but was opposed by the government. That it was being looked at, that it was complicated, but that some measure would be taken. And 2 years later, we get the IPCC report and no action taken by the government. The fight against climate change needs more than carbon taxes and large wind farms as a solution. Support for microgeneration of renewable projects at local and community level is one way to get people involved in and effectively democratising the energy system. It's the first small, simple step that we could take to signal that we are serious about climate change. We must first reduce the demand for energy, the demand for fossil fuels, and households and local communities that can provide for their own energy demand via renewable sources could make a huge impact on the steps that we need to take. But going further and allowing those people to supply electricity back to the grid would also make a huge difference in the years ahead in reducing the demand for energy. I hear many of the objections, and it strikes me as amazing that, given what's at stake, we hear question marks over this bill and references what the market will or will not take when it comes to making a proposal such as this. And that now there's a message from government that they may have to use the money message against Deputy Stanley's bill. It's as if tackling climate change was an optional extra and possibly just one extra policy decision that you may or may not make. This bill needs to be supported. If the Minister's recent rhetoric, and we heard your rhetoric, Minister, on climate change, and if the recent press releases about all of government's approaches and large climate action funds mean anything, you will support this bill. But I suspect that the spin and the promises are just an attempt to mask the gross and negligent failure of this government's policy and you, the Minister, for what is known locally here, sometimes in the House, as the Minister for Climate Inaction. In doing so, the reality of this government is being exposed, that clearly, as a country, to tackle climate change in any serious way, we will probably have to get rid of this government in the first instance.
Thank you very much.